Come on. All right, today we're going to start covering chapter 3, financial ratios. Who actually has read the chapter or looked at the chapter? Unfortunately, I know that's a rhetorical question, but it's always a good idea to read the chapter before coming to class. Basically, you have a rough idea about the topic that I'm going to talk about, but that's your business. I mean, you would understand it better if you read the chapter ahead of time. Who has heard of things called financial ratios? Anybody has any interest in investing? Anything? So you never heard of things called financial ratios? Okay. Um, Financial ratios are ratios of items from financial statements. Obviously, we can form any ratio we want. I mean, there are lots of items in balance sheet, lots of items in income statement. There's stuff even in cash flow statement. You know, just think about only the binary pairs. You can do hundreds, thousands of ratios. If things involve even operations on those, it could go up to millions. Does that mean that we should go ahead and what was your name? Perry? That doesn't mean that we're going to form all these ratios. Just like the financial statements themselves, financial ratios are used to tell stories. Okay? Either about the firm or comparison of the firm against the others. In fact, more often than not, that's what we use it, or comparing the firm now, what it was in the past. In a sense, firms in the past are different firms. Firms grow organically, they make money, they add some or all of that money back to the firm, so they grow. Or firms grow by acquiring other firms. For example, Microsoft is the firm that's about worth $3 trillion these days. NVIDIA is another firm that's about two and a half. It probably should be worth five, in my own opinion, but for some, uh, by some miracle, suppose Microsoft acquired NVIDIA. That would not ever pass muster with the regulatory authorities. You know, too much power. One is kind of a big player on the software side, the other a big player on the hardware side, especially on the AI business. Nobody would ever approve that. Maybe under a Republican administration with 60 senators, it may pass. But we know that that's not going to happen either on the Democratic side or Republican side. Suppose that happened. Suddenly there's a new firm that's worth about five and a half. After the merger, it will probably go down in value, let's say 5 trillion. The company after the merger and the company even adding the pieces before the merger are not the same companies. They're in different sizes. So just to make comparisons of before the merger and after the merger of the same company, you're going to have to get rid of at least the size factor. Okay. Financial ratios, to one extent or another, get rid of that size factor. You know, NVIDIA, for example, is a big player on the GPU side on AI. They're worth about $2.5 trillion. There is another company I like, Micron Systems. They do high-speed memory chips that are primarily used in AI systems, and they're worth about 100 billion, which is not too shabby. But those two companies, if you look at the sales of NVIDIA, it's much, much larger than what you want to call Micron. And similarly, NVIDIA's profits are much, much larger than Micron. So if I want to compare the two, I got to get to the scale factor. I don't know if NVIDIA is a lot more profitable than Micron because it is bigger, or, pound for pound, they're making more money. Without looking at things, I can't decide that. When we form financial ratios, first and foremost, we have to declare purpose of the ratio. Just like, think of this as a conversation you're having with a friend. Why are you having that conversation? Okay, it has to have a purpose. And what is that purpose? Whether or not you will achieve that purpose, that's besides the point. Just like in a story, there needs to be a reason for telling that story. We need to know what numbers mean or how they can be interpreted. And what are some low, normal, and I'm going to put that in quotes, and high numbers. Let's start with, even though we're going to cover this in detail later, probably there's a financial ratio all of you have heard, but you never thought of that as a financial ratio. Anybody here has heard something called price earnings ratio or PE ratio? If you don't live in Mars or you're not a anthropology major, you probably heard about that. Okay. As the name suggests, it divides the price per share of the company by earnings per share of the company, or value of the entire company with the earnings for 1 year. All right. Now, what's the purpose of telling this? At a minimum, I can kind of tell a story. PE ratio. Let me do that in a different color. Price per share divided by earnings per share. And generically, we're going to write that as P over EPS. Earnings is another name for the net income of the company. Suppose I told you a story. What if you could assume that earnings per share is going to remain the same ad infinitum? Okay. Then PE ratio tells you how many, remember that EPS is earnings for 1 year. That EPS can be interpreted as I don't know what happened to this one. We'll go back somewhere and come back. Let me reopen it. Somehow it froze. Okay. That shouldn't happen, but The old fixing system of turn it off and turn it on again works. That actually happened to me back in early 90s. I was working on my PhD in economics at Boston College, which I never ended up finishing. But after doing the theory parts, I was working on very high advanced statistical stuff, which we call econometrics in economics. And I had to write a complicated code in order to implement, what I proposed theoretically. It was tough, but I wrote the code, 2,000 lines of code, maybe more. And, and I run it with some sample data. It's supposed to work, but it's not. I mean, I went through every single line in the code, and usually when you write codes, you kind of divide it into modular pieces because it's a lot easier to debug modular pieces. It's that 2,000 lines of code is probably 100 different modules. Then you put them all together. Yeah, it should work. I spent over a weekend checking the code. There's not an error. And, I was in my late 20s. So now I probably wouldn't have seen some of the errors, but then I had no problem. I had almost photographic memory, or I should say eidetic. Photographic is different. I can't remember pictures, but I can remember numbers and other stuff. It doesn't work. I worked till wee hours of Sunday evening and Monday morning. Finally, I said, okay, you need some rest. At least your eyes need some rest.